What if Omni-Man landed in Warhammer 40k? The sky above Hive Tertius didn't just break, it screamed. Clouds tore apart like wounded flesh as something massive punched through the atmosphere at speeds that made reality itself shudder. Citizens in the lower spires looked up from their 18-hour shifts in the Prometheum refineries and saw fire bleeding across the heavens. The air pressure changed, windows shattered across 17 levels, and then impact. The explosion cratered an entire hab block, vaporizing 12,000 souls in an instant. When the smoke began to clear, the Adeptus Arbites positioned on the perimeter saw something that defied every protocol in their data slates. A figure, walking, unburned, unbowed. The man who emerged from that crater wore no armor, carried no weapons, and radiated a presence that made veteran enforcers reach for shock mauls with trembling hands. Omni-Man stood in the ruins and breathed. The air tasted wrong, recycled through 10,000 kilometers of ventilation systems, thick with industrial waste and human desperation. This wasn't Earth. The architecture alone told him that. Gothic spires stretched into a polluted sky like the fingers of drowning giants. Gargoyles the size of tanks leered from every surface. And everywhere, he saw the symbol. A two-headed eagle, stamped on walls, banners, the armor of soldiers now surrounding him. He'd crashed into civilizations before, he'd toppled governments, ended wars, rewritten histories. But something about this place felt different, heavier, like the weight of 10,000 years of suffering had soaked into every stone. The soldiers approaching him weren't just afraid, they were fanatical. Their eyes held the glazed certainty of men who'd never questioned an order in their lives. The Arbites precinct marshal raised his power maul and amplified his voice through voxcas. Ters that crackled with static. Unknown entity, you stand in violation of 17 imperial laws. Surrender immediately for processing or face extermination. His squad, 40 armored enforcers with shotguns and riot shields, formed a textbook containment pattern. Omni-Man tilted his head. He'd heard similar ultimatums on 100 worlds. Usually he'd try diplomacy first, explain who he was, offer assistance. But the Marshal's follow-up order came too quickly. Psyker teams, advance for classification. Servitors, prepare neural probes. Servitors. Omni-Man's enhanced vision focused on the figures shuffling forward. Humans fused with machinery, lobotomized and repurposed as walking tools. His jaw tightened. Whatever civilization this was, it had already shown him its soul, and he didn't like what he saw. Before the servitors could reach him, Omni-Man moved, not at full speed, that would have been overkill, just fast enough to disarm the nearest Arbites without killing them. 40 weapons clattered to the ground in 1.3 seconds. The enforcers stumbled back, suddenly defenseless, staring at their empty hands in incomprehension. Omni-Man floated 3 feet off the ground, arms crossed, letting them see what they were dealing with. "I'm not your enemy," he said, voice carrying across the ruins without shouting. "I'm not from this world. My ship malfunctioned. I need information, not conflict." The Marshal's response was immediate. He pressed a red rune on his vambrace, and sirens began wailing across the entire Hive city. Not retreat sirens, escalation sirens. Within seconds, Omni-Man heard it, heavy engines growing louder, gunships, dozens of them, and behind that sound, something deeper, a rhythmic pounding, footsteps, big ones. The Adeptus Astartes arrived like a chapter from a nightmare. Their Thunderhawk gunship descended through the smoke, and when the assault ramp dropped, 8 Space Marines of the Crimson Fists stepped onto the rubble. Each stood over 7 feet tall in ceramite armor, thicker than tank plating. Their bolters, mass-reactive guns that fired explosive rounds, tracked Omni-Man with mechanical precision. The squad sergeant's helmet lenses glowed red in the gathering darkness. His voice came through external vox speakers, inhuman and final. "Unidentified Xenos, you have committed acts of aggression against the Imperium of Man. The penalty is death. You will be granted the Emperor's mercy." Omni-Man had faced superhumans before, Viltrumites, Thraxans, Earth's greatest heroes. But these warriors weren't posturing, they weren't hesitating. The moment their sergeant finished speaking, they opened fire, and the real nightmare began. Bolter rounds hit like sledgehammers wrapped in explosives. Each shell buried itself into a target before detonating, designed to destroy everything from unarmored infantry to light vehicles. Against Omni-Man, they bounced off his skin or shattered on impact, filling the air with shrapnel and smoke. He didn't flinch, didn't retreat. For 3 full seconds, he let them shoot, let them empty their magazines, let them see the futility. When the firing stopped, he was unmarked. The Astartes reloaded with practiced efficiency, but their body language had changed. Tension, recalculation. The sergeant activated his Vox link to command. Contact with unknown Xenos entity, bolter-resistant physiology, possible warp corruption, requesting immediate inquisitorial oversight. Omni-Man heard every word with his enhanced hearing. Warp corruption, Xenos, inquisitorial. None of those words meant anything to him yet, but he understood tone, and he understood escalation. This wasn't first contact, this was extermination protocol. High above the engagement zone, in a command spire that pierced the planet's atmospheric ceiling, Inquisitor Viridius of the Ordo Xenos reviewed the initial reports with cold, analytical precision. His augmented eyes scanned picked captures of the entity, humanoid, unarmored, biologically intact despite orbital re-entry and sustained bolter fire. His servo skull catalogued the data, no psychic signature, no warp taint detected, but also no known Xenos profile match. Unprecedented. Viridius had served the Imperium for 93 years. He'd purged Genestealer cults, hunted Eldar corsairs, supervised 17 exterminatus orders. In all that time, he'd learned one fundamental truth. Anything the Imperium didn't understand was a threat to be eliminated. He tapped a command rune on his throne's armrest, and across the planet, kill teams began mobilizing. Assassins, tech priests, psychic warfare specialists, and if those failed, the Navy flotilla in orbit had cyclonic torpedoes ready to reduce the entire hive to radioactive glass. On the ground, Omni-Man made a decision. He'd tried diplomacy, he'd shown restraint, but this civilization responded only to force, not as a language of respect, but as a trigger for greater violence. Fine, if they wanted to see what he could do, he'd give them a demonstration. The Crimson Fist's sergeant was coordinating reinforcements when Omni-Man moved at true combat speed. The Astartes barely registered motion before he was among them. One Marine went down with a precision strike to the helmet that cracked ceramite like pottery. Another flew backward through a ruined wall, his armor system screaming damage warnings. Omni-Man wasn't trying to kill, not yet, but every strike proved a point. Their armor, their weapons, their augmented physiology meant nothing against a Viltrumite. The sergeant roared in defiance, raising his chainsword. The blade's teeth screamed to life, and he swung with centuries of battle experience. Omni-Man caught the weapon bare-handed, stopping its momentum completely. The chainsword shattered against his grip, and in that moment, both warrior and soldier understood. This wasn't a fight. This was execution waiting to happen. The only question was, who would die first? If you crave more tales of impossible collisions and grimdark consequences, hit that subscribe button. Because in the next chapter, we're diving deep into exactly what the Imperium does when it encounters something it can't immediately categorize. And trust me, their solution is far worse than you imagine. The Psyker's name was Theron, though names meant little after the black ships took you. He'd served the Imperium for 6 years as a sanctioned psychic operative, long enough to read the surface thoughts of heretics, short enough that the warp hadn't devoured his sanity yet. When Inquisitor Viridius ordered him to probe the unknown entity's mind, Theron felt dread coil in his stone. Like frozen wire, he'd touched alien consciousnesses before. Orc savagery, Eldar arrogance, even the chittering void hunger of Tyrannid synapse creatures. But as he extended his psychic awareness toward Omni-Man, what he found wasn't alien at all. It was absence, no warp signature, no psychic echo, just a biological organism so fundamentally isolated from the immaterium that touching his mind felt like pressing against a wall of unbreakable glass. Theron pushed harder, desperate to give his Inquisitor something useful, and then the wall pushed back. Blood exploded from Theron's eyes, nose, and ears simultaneously. His scream lasted less than a second before his brain liquefied inside his skull, pressure cooked by the catastrophic psychic backlash. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, smoke rising from his empty eye sockets. The other psychers in the chamber, 3 more sanctioned operatives monitoring the ritual, felt the psychic shockwave and staggered backward, clutching their heads. One vomited blood. Another began speaking in tongues, his mind touching something in the warp that noticed him back. The third simply whispered, "It's not chaos. It's worse. It's nothing." Inquisitor Viridius watched the psycher's corpse cool and added a notation to his data slate. Entity demonstrates extreme anti-psychic properties. Hypothesis: blank or unknown Xenos nullfield. Classification elevated to Alpha-Omega threat level. Within minutes, that classification transmitted to every Imperial authority within 3 sectors. Far below, in the ruins of the Hab block, Omni-Man felt something wrong. A pressure against his mind, like invisible fingers trying to pry open his skull. It lasted half a heartbeat before vanishing, followed by a sensation he couldn't quite explain, the awareness of something dying nearby because of him. He didn't know what these people had tried, didn't understand their technology or their methods, but he understood consequences. Whatever they'd attempted had killed one of their own, and they'd blame him for it. The Crimson Fist's sergeant, still conscious despite his shattered armor, spat blood onto the rubble and laughed. It was a bitter, exhausted sound. "You killed a psyker just by existing," he rasped through his helmet's damaged vox. "The Inquisition will burn this entire world to ash before they let you leave." Omni-Man grabbed the Marine by his gorget and lifted him effortlessly. "Then tell them to stop. I don't want to fight you." The sergeant's response came cold and absolute. "We don't surrender. We don't negotiate. We are the Emperor's angels of death, and we serve until we fall." He triggered something on his armor's internal systems, a locator beacon. Omni-Man realized too late. "My brothers are coming, hundreds of them, and when they arrive, you'll learn what it means to face the Imperium's wrath." Omni-Man set him down gently, almost carefully, and stepped back. He'd fought fanatics before, Viltrumite loyalists who'd rather die than question the Empire. But these Space Marines operated on a different level of indoctrination. They weren't afraid of death. They welcomed it as long as it served their Emperor. Reasoning with them was impossible. Fighting them felt increasingly inevitable. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his son Mark whispered, "This isn't conquest anymore, Dad. This is survival." The Mechanicus Data Collectio. N-Team arrived next, descending from a Scorpius hover transport in clouds of incense and machine cant. Tech Priest Dominus Arxis 773 approached the engagement zone with 12 armed Skitarii Rangers and a mobile cogitator array the size of a cargo container. His organic eye, the only flesh remaining in his skull, studied Omni-Man through 17 different visual spectrums simultaneously. Infrared, ultraviolet, radiation, electromagnetic. Each scan returned data that contradicted the last. The entity registered body heat, but at levels impossible for baseline human biology. No cybernetic implants detected, yet physical performance exceeded even the most heavily augmented Skitarii. And most troubling, zero detectable power source, no reactor, no fuel cells, no warp taint. The entity simply was, burning calories at impossible efficiency. Arxis 773's mechanical voice crackled through his Vox grill. Biological paradox detected, requesting live specimen extraction for detailed analysis. Omni-Man watched the Tech Priest's spider-like servo arms unfold, each tipped with surgical tools designed to cut through tank armor. Behind Arxis, the Skitarii leveled their galvanic rifles, weapons that fired electrically charged bullets capable of cooking targets from the inside out. He'd been patient, he'd shown restraint, he'd even tried to minimize casualties, but these people responded to mercy with escalation and to questions with violence. Fine. If they wanted a demonstration of what he could actually do, he'd give them one they'd never forget. He moved at combat speed, not holding back anymore. The Skitarii fired, but he was already gone, their targeting systems unable to track movement that broke the sound barrier in 3 steps. He appeared behind Arxis 773 and tapped the Tech Priest's shoulder. Just a tap, just enough force to crack the ceramite plating and send every alarm in. The Dominus's body screaming. "Stop," Omni-Man said quietly, "before someone gets hurt." ArcSys 773 processed the interaction in 0.003 seconds. The entity had crossed 40 meters of open ground in the time it took his optical sensors to refresh, had bypassed 12 armed soldiers without triggering a single shot, had touched him with enough precision to damage armor without pulping the organic components beneath. This was not a creature operating on baseline physics. This was something that rewrote the laws of combat through sheer biological superiority. The tech priest's remaining organic neuron clusters fired a single conclusion to his inquisitorial overseer. Entity demonstrates transhuman capabilities exceeding all known Xenos classifications. Recommend immediate containment via orbital bombardment. But Viridius had already reached that conclusion himself. High in his command spire, the Inquisitor stared at live pict feeds from 3 different sources and watched Omni-Man stand calmly amid the wreckage, waiting for the next attack. Viridius had spent 93 years learning to read threats, and everything about this entity screamed one word: extinction. The order went out across encrypted Vox channels that spanned the entire planetary defense network. Naval Command received it first. Prepare Lance batteries for precision orbital strike. Target coordinates transmitted. Authorization: Inquisitorial Override Sigma 7. The Imperial Guard regiments stationed in neighboring Hive cities mobilized. Full siege deployment. Entity is to be contained within blast radius or destroyed outright. No prisoners, no quarter. And most terrifying of all, the message that reached the astropathic choir deep in the planetary core. Transmit distress signal to nearest Space Marine chapter fleet. Request immediate reinforcement. Threat classification. Potential Demon Prince manifestation. Across the Imperium, the bureaucracy of annihilation ground into emotion, and Omni-Man, standing in the ruins of a city he'd never meant to harm, felt the weight of an entire galaxy's paranoia settle onto his shoulders. He'd crashed into civilizations before, but this one didn't want to understand him. It wanted to erase him. And the worst part, he was starting to think they might actually have the firepower to do it. The first Lance strike came without warning. From orbit, the Imperial Navy cruiser Adamant Virtue adjusted its trajectory by 0.03 degrees and fired a coherent beam of superheated energy powerful enough to core a continent. The beam traveled at light speed, impossible to dodge, impossible to see coming. It punched through 12 kilometers of polluted atmosphere in a microsecond and struck the ruins of Hab Block Tertius with the force of a small nuclear weapon. The impact vaporized 3 city blocks instantly, turning stone and steel into plasma. The shockwave shattered windows across half the Hive city, and when the light cleared, there was nothing left but a glowing crater of molten rock. The naval captain aboard the Adamant Virtue studied the auger readings and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Target eliminated. Threat neutralized. He opened a Vox channel to the Inquisitor. "My lord, Lance strike successful. No life signs detected in impact zone." Viridius didn't celebrate. "Continue scanning. If it survived re-entry, it can survive." His words cut off as new readings flooded the auger screens. Omni-Man burst from the molten crater like a missile launched from hell itself. He'd had maybe half a second warning, his enhanced hearing catching the air ionizing before the beam arrived. Not enough time to dodge, but enough to brace. The Lance strike had hit him with enough energy to annihilate a city, and it had hurt. His skin burned, his muscles ached. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare universe, he'd felt actual pain. But Viltrumites were bred for war across centuries of selective evolution. Pain was just data, and the data told him exactly where that attack had originated. He looked up through the polluted sky, his vision penetrating clouds and atmospheric haze until he saw it. A massive warship in orbit, bristling with weapons, its hull decorated with skulls and eagles. They'd tried to kill him from space, without negotiation, without hesitation. The restraint he'd been clinging to evaporated like morning dew in a furnace. If they wanted war, he'd bring it to their doorstep. The flight through atmosphere took 11 seconds. Omni-Man accelerated past Mach 20, his body shedding a sonic boom that shattered every window in the Hive city below. He climbed through the troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, environments that would kill unprotected humans in heartbeats. The cold didn't touch him. The lack of oxygen meant nothing to Viltrumite biology that could hold breath for weeks. He entered the thermosphere where satellites burned and kept climbing, faster, higher, until he broke free of the planet's gravity well entirely. And there, hanging in the void like a cathedral built for murder, was the adamant virtue. The ship stretched 3 kilometers from bow to stern, its Gothic architecture somehow more disturbing in the silence of space. Gun batteries covered every surface, lance arrays glowed with charging energy, and along its hull, Omni-Man saw T-X inscribed in letters 50 meters tall, "The Emperor Protects." He wondered what they needed protection from. Then he showed them. The naval crew never saw him coming. Their auger arrays, designed to track incoming torpedoes and enemy warships, couldn't process a single humanoid target moving at orbital combat speeds. One moment, the void was empty. The next, something punched through the ship's void shields like they were tissue paper. Omni-Man hit the portside lance battery at full speed, and 30,000 tons of military-grade weaponry exploded in a chain reaction that gutted an entire deck. Alarms screamed throughout the vessel. Bulkhead doors slammed shut, sealing off breached sections. The captain, a veteran of 40 years of void warfare, stared at his tactical display in incomprehension. "Status report. What hit us?" His weapons officer's voice cracked with panic. "Unknown, sir. No torpedo launch detected. No enemy vessels on auger. It's inside the ship." Inside. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Nothing living could survive in the void. Nothing could breach void shields without massive ordnance. But the secondary explosions rippling through the adamant virtue's superstructure told a different story. Omni-Man moved through the warship's interior like a force of nature given flesh. He wasn't trying to kill the crew, not directly. He was destroying infrastructure. Power conduits, life support systems, weapons arrays, each strike calculated to disable rather than massacre. But the ship fought back with everything it had. Auto turrets opened fire, filling corridors with bolt rounds and laser fire. He tanked the damage and kept moving. Blast doors tried to trap him in sealed sections. He punched through them like cardboard. Armsmen, regular humans in carapace armor wielding lasguns, formed firing lines and emptied their power packs into his approaching form. The laser fire scorched his suit and stung his skin, but Viltrumite's cellular density turned potentially fatal wounds into minor annoyances. He scattered the armsmen with precise strikes, sending them flying into bulkheads hard enough to break bones, but not kill. They'd wake up later with concussions and shattered pride, better than being corpses. The ship's commanding officers made a desperate decision. If they couldn't stop the entity with conventional arms, they'd use the nuclear option. Literally, deep in the adamant virtue's core, tech priests initiated the plasma reactor overload sequence. The ship would die, but it would take the entity with it. The reactor's containment fields began failing in controlled stages, building toward a catastrophic explosion that would rival a small sun. Everyone aboard received the same Vox transmission. "All hands, abandon ship. Repeat, all hands abandon ship. Reactor breach in T-4 minutes." Evacuation sirens wailed. Crew members scrambled for life pods. And in the chaos, nobody noticed Omni-Man changing direction, flying deeper into the ship instead of escaping. He'd heard the transmission, understood the implication. They were going to blow their own vessel to kill him. The issue. Osans of their own people still aboard, and they'd sacrifice them all without hesitation. This wasn't military pragmatism. This was fanaticism so complete it made Viltrumite doctrine look merciful by comparison. Omni-Man reached the reactor chamber in 90 seconds. The space was massive, a cathedral of machinery and barely contained stellar fury. Plasma conduits the size of buildings spiraled around a central containment sphere where temperatures exceeded the surface of stars. Tech priests chanted prayers to their machine god while frantically manipulating control systems. When Omni-Man crashed through the reinforced blast door, they turned to face him with expressions of religious ecstasy. One of them, an ancient magos with more cybernetics than flesh, spread his mechadendrites wide. "The Omnissiah has sent us a martyr's death. We die in service to Mars and Terra." Omni-Man ignored the speech. He flew directly to the reactor core, grabbed the containment sphere with both hands and pulled. Metal screamed. Energy arcs lashed across his body like whips made of lightning. The tech priests watched in paralyzed horror as he did the impossible. He stabilized the overload manually, using his body as a living heat sink to absorb the excess plasma energy. The reactor's death scream faded to a controlled hum. The adamant virtue didn't explode. Instead, it went dark. Power systems failing across every deck, auxiliary systems struggling to compensate. In the sudden silence, the captain understood what had happened. The entity hadn't destroyed them, it had saved them, not because it was merciful, but to make a point. His vox crackled to life with Inquisitor Viridius's voice, cold and analytical. "Captain, report status." The captain took a shaky breath. "Sir, the entity, it prevented the reactor breach. It's still aboard. And sir," he paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound insane, "I think it's trying not to kill us." Viridius processed that information for exactly 3 seconds. Then he gave the order that would shape everything to follow. "All vessels in fleet, target the adamant virtue. If the entity remains aboard, we destroy the ship anyway, for the Emperor." The captain heard the transmission and felt something he hadn't experienced in 40 years of military service. Not fear of death. He'd made peace with that decades ago. No, what he felt was far worse. The realization that his own side valued victory over survival. And the entity currently standing in his reactor room had just demonstrated more regard for human life than the Inquisition. Omni-Man felt the ship shudder as the first torpedo struck its starboard hull. He was still in the reactor chamber, still surrounded by terrified tech priests who'd watched him prevent their martyrdom. Through the reinforced walls, he heard secondary explosions rippling across multiple decks. The fleet wasn't giving the adamant virtue time to evacuate. They were executing their own people without hesitation, without remorse. He'd seen pragmatic brutality before, Viltrumite cullings, necessary sacrifices for the Empire's survival. But this wasn't pragmatism. This was ideological purity, taken to its logical extreme. The Wettenschau Imperium would rather kill thousands of loyal servants than risk one unknown variable escaping. The ancient Magos who'd welcomed martyrdom moments ago now stared at Omni-Man with something approaching horror. You tried to save us, and they're killing us anyway." Omni-Man met his gaze. "Welcome to being expendable." Then he flew straight up, punching through 6 decks of reinforced armor plating to reach the void. The escape took seconds, but those seconds cost the adamant virtue everything. 3 more cruisers had joined the bombardment, their lance batteries carving glowing wounds across the dying ship's hull. Omni-Man emerged into hard vacuum just as the main magazine detonated, a chain reaction that split the vessel's spine and sent debris expanding in a rapidly growing sphere of destruction. He hovered in the debris field and watched 3,000 souls die because their commanders valued doctrine over life. Life pods ejected in clusters, tiny metal seeds fleeing the explosion. Some made it clear. Others were caught in secondary blasts or shredded by shrapnel. Omni-Man could save maybe a dozen if he moved fast enough, but the fleet had already marked him. Every gun battery within range locked onto his position. He had a choice: save a handful of crew members and take fire from 4 warships, or retreat and survive. The pragmatic Viltrumite part of his brain chose survival. The part that sounded like his son chose differently. He moved through the debris field at speeds that made targeting solutions impossible, grabbed a tumbling life pod, accelerated it toward the nearest friendly vessel, then banked hard to collect another. The fleet opened fire, not precision strikes now, but saturation bombardment. The void filled with lance beams, macro cannon shells, and torpedo spreads designed to kill capital ships. Omni-Man dodged most of it through sheer speed, tanked the rest through Viltrumite durability. A macro shell the size of a cargo container clipped his shoulder and detonated, spinning him through a cloud of superheated plasma. It hurt. Emperor above, it hurt. But he kept moving, kept grabbing pods, kept hurling them towards safety like a man trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. By the time the adamant virtue fully collapsed into an expanding cloud of radioactive debris, he'd saved 43 crew members. Not enough, never enough, but more than the Imperium had tried to save. He fled the engagement zone before the fleet could regroup, bleeding from a dozen wounds that would heal in hours, wondering what kind of civilization executed its own defenders for being in the wrong place. Deep in the eye of terror, where reality bled into nightmare and the warp consumed all distinction between thought and matter, something vast and terrible stirred. Horn, the blood god, sat upon his throne of brass and skulls and felt a ripple in the great game, a new player entering the board, not a psyker whose soul could be corrupted, not a mortal whose rage could be harvested. Something else, something that killed without worship, fought without prayer, and rejected divine attention with the same brutal efficiency it applied to combat. The god of war and murder leaned forward on his throne, and across 1,000,000 battlefields throughout the galaxy, berserkers paused mid-slaughter as their patron's interest accused elsewhere. Bloodletters in the warp felt it too, a presence that resonated with violence but refused to acknowledge their existence. Horn spoke in a voice that shook the foundations of the immaterium itself. Blood has been spilled, skulls have been taken, but no prayer was offered, no glory was claimed. His bloodthirster generals stirred uneasily. A warrior who killed without worship was an insult to everything Horn represented. In the Palace of Schemes, Tzeentch observed the same phenomenon through 10,000 different perspectives simultaneously. The Architect of Fate saw possibilities branching from Omni-Man's arrival, timelines splitting and reforming, futures collapsing and expanding in ways that even divine precognition struggled to predict. The entity was a variable outside the Great Game's normal parameters. Not chaos, not order, simply other. Tzeentch's multitude of voices whispered in contradictory harmony. A piece moves across the board that answers to no player. It cannot be predicted because it operates outside prediction's framework. It cannot be manipulated because it does not seek what we offer. Fascinating, infuriating, necessary. Pink and blue horrors danced through the impossible fortress, giggling and shrieking as new schemes formed and reformed in their master's endless mind. If the entity could not be corrupted, perhaps it could be redirected, pointed toward Tzeentch's enemies like a living weapon. The possibilities were delicious. Back in real space, Omni-Man found shelter on a dead moon orbiting a gas giant 3 systems away from the conflict. He'd pushed his speed to the absolute limit, flying faster than any Imperial vessel could track, leaving no warp signature for navigators to follow. The moon had no atmosphere, no life, no strategic value, which made it perfect for recovery. He landed in a crater older than human civilization and allowed himself to feel the exhaustion. Viltrumites could fight for days without rest, but even superhuman endurance had limits. The wounds from the fleet engagement were already closing, his cellular regeneration knitting flesh and bone back together at visible speed. In an hour, he'd be fully healed. In 2, he'd be ready to move again. But ready to move where? He'd crashed into this universe by accident, his ship's dimensional drive malfunctioning during what should have been a routine scouting mission. Now he was stranded in a galaxy that responded to his presence with immediate extermination protocols. No way home, no allies, just an entire civilization dedicated to his destruction. He thought about the people he'd saved from the adamant virtue. 43 lives out of 3,000, a rounding error in the Imperium's ledger, but each one represented a choice he'd made to prioritize mercy over self-preservation. Would they remember that? Would they tell their superiors that the so-called threat had saved them while their own fleet had tried to kill them? Or would the propaganda machine erase that narrative, turning him into a monster, regardless of truth? Omni-Man had served the Viltrumite Empire for centuries. He understood how empires functioned, how they controlled information, shaped perception, manufactured consent for atrocities. The Imperium operated on the same principles, just scaled to galactic proportions and backed by religious fanaticism. Fighty. Now, it wasn't a matter of strength. He could kill individual soldiers, destroy individual ships, level individual cities, but you couldn't punch an ideology to death. You couldn't fly fast enough to outrun cultural programming 10,000 years in the making. For the first time since arriving, he felt something close to despair. The feeling didn't last long. Despair was a luxury warriors couldn't afford. He stood, stretched his healing muscles, and looked up at the stars. Billions of them, scattered across a galaxy so vast it made the Viltrumite Empire look like a neighborhood dispute. Somewhere out there was a way home, or if not home, then somewhere he could exist without constant warfare. The Imperium controlled much of human-occupied space, but the galaxy was bigger than humanity. There were other races, other factions. Maybe some of them were less immediately hostile. Maybe some of them valued strength without demanding worship. It was a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. He kicked off from the dead moon's surface and accelerated into the void, choosing a direction at random. Behind him, unknown and unfelt, the attention of gods and inquisitors followed his trajectory. The great game had noticed him now, and once the ruinous powers took interest in a mortal soul, that interest rarely ended well. On the bridge of the inquisitorial fortress ship Eternal Vigilance, Viridius convened an emergency council via hololithic projection. 3 other inquisitors materialized around the tactical table, representatives from the Ordo Malleus, Ordo Hereticus, and his own Ordo Xenos. Each had reviewed the data. Each had reached the same conclusion. The entity represented a threat on par with Demon Prince manifestation. Lord Inquisitor Matthias of the Malleus spoke first, his voice distorted by centuries of augmetic modification. The entity demonstrates no warp presence. Therefore, it cannot be demonic. I recommend transferring authority to Ordo Xenos. Viridius nodded. Agreed, but we must also consider chaos interest. The entity has killed without prayer, fought without corruption. The blood god will notice. Zinch already has. Inquisitor Selena of the Hereticus, her face hidden behind an ornate death mask, added her assessment. And what of the entity's demonstrated restraint? It saved Imperial personnel even while under fire. That suggests rational thought. Perhaps diplomatic contact. The word hung in the air like heresy. Viridius let the silence stretch before responding. Diplomacy is for humans who accept the Emperor's light. This entity has rejected every attempt at classification. It must be destroyed. The only question is, how? Omni-Man's random trajectory through the void led him to a system the Imperium had abandoned 3 centuries ago. The star charts, stolen from the Adamant Virtue during his brief time aboard, labeled it Golax Prime, marked with skull iconography and a single word, Perdita, lost. He descended toward the primary world cautiously, scanning for threats, ready to flee at the first sign of Imperial presence. What he found instead was war. Not the organized, doctrine-driven warfare of the Imperium, but raw, chaotic violence that painted the planet's surface in shades of green and red. Explosions dotted the landscape like festival fireworks. Crude rockets screamed through the atmosphere, trailing black smoke. And everywhere, he heard it. A sound that started as distant rumbling and crescendoed into a galaxy-spanning roar of pure, joyous violence. Wah! Omni-Man had found the Orcs, and the Orcs, in their infinite enthusiasm for combat, had found something worth fighting. He landed on the outskirts of what might have once been an Imperial city. Now it was a war zone where physics took coffee breaks and logic went to die. Orc constructs, vehicles that shouldn't function according to any rational engineering principle, rumbled past, belching smoke and fire. Greenskins the size of small cars bellowed war cries and fired weapons held together with scrap metal and blind faith, and charging against them, somehow holding the line, were humans, not Imperial Guard in their organized regiments, not Space Marines in their blessed armor, just survivors. Refugees who'd stayed when the Imperium abandoned them, who'd learned to fight Orcs with salvaged weapons and desperate courage. Omni-Man watched a makeshift barricade explode under Orc artillery fire, watched defenders scatter and regroup, watched them hold their ground against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. Something in his chest tightened. These people fought without an emperor, without space marines, without the crushing machinery of Imperial doctrine. They fought because the alternative was extinction. A massive Orc warboss, easily 12 feet tall, covered in thick armor plates and swinging a power claw that crackled with unstable energy, smashed through the human defensive line like a wrecking ball through paper. Defenders tried to bring it down with concentrated lance fire, but the creature's hide was too thick, its momentum too great. It grabbed a screaming soldier, lifted him overhead, and prepared to tear him in half, just for the entertainment value. Omni-Man moved. He crossed 300 meters in the time it took the war boss to begin pulling, slammed into the greenskin with enough force to send both of them tumbling through a ruined building. The soldier dropped, gasped, scrambled away. The war boss rose from the rubble laughing, actually laughing, with genuine delight. "Oi, now that's a proper fight." It charged again, power claw swinging in a wide arc designed to bisect Omni-Man at the waist. He caught the claw mid-swing, and for the first time since arriving in this universe, he smiled. Finally, an enemy that wanted to fight without doctrine, without ideology, without fanatical devotion to absent gods. Just pure, simple combat. The battle lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes of brutal, kinetic violence that reduced the surrounding ruins to rubble and sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. The warboss hit like a tank and moved like a freight train, its power claw carving glowing trails through the air. But Omni-Man hit harder, moved faster, fought with centuries of Viltrumite combat experience refined across 100 worlds. He broke the power claw's hydraulics with a precision strike, shattered the warboss's armor plates with calculated impacts, and when the green skin finally collapsed, still grinning, still laughing, blood pouring from a dozen wounds, it wheezed something that might have been respect. "You're the best scrap I ever had, Humie. Come back when." Eyes fixed up. "We'll go again." Then it passed out, and the surrounding orcs, witnessing their leader's defeat, did something unexpected. They cheered. Not in mourning, but in celebration, because orcs didn't care who won, they cared about the fight, and that had been a glorious fight. The human defenders approached Omni-Man with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Their leader, a woman missing her left arm, replaced with a crude mechanical prosthetic, stepped forward first. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting too long with too little. "I don't know what you are. Don't care if you're mutant, abhuman, or something worse. You saved my people. That buys you a conversation." She gestured toward the settlement's interior, a ramshackle collection of buildings held together with prayers and welding. "Come, rest, explain." Omni-Man followed, aware that every human present was watching him with weapons half raised, ready to flee or fight depending on his next move. Inside a structure that might have been a church once, the woman introduced herself as Commander Vaith, former Imperial Guard sergeant left behind during the Golak's withdrawal. She'd spent 15 years turning refugees into soldiers, scavengers into survivors, and now she stared at Omni-Man with calculating eyes. "So, what are you running from?" Omni-Man considered lying, considered deflecting, but these people had survived orc invasions without Imperial support for 15 years. They deserved honesty. "The Imperium," he said simply. "I crashed on one of their worlds, tried to communicate. They responded with extermination protocols." Vaith laughed, a bitter, knowing sound. "Of course they did. The Imperium doesn't do diplomacy. It does compliance or corpses." She poured something that smelled like industrial solvent into 2 cups and offered one to Omni-Man. "You're not the first refugee we've sheltered. Lost worlds like Golaks attract the abandoned. Rogue traders, failed colonists, excommunicated tech priests, even a few space marines who couldn't stomach their chapter's fanaticism anymore." She drank deeply, winced, and continued. "We don't ask where you came from. Don't care what heresies you've committed. You fight the orcs, you contribute to survival, you're one of us. Simple as that." Omni-Man studied her face, scarred, exhausted, but alive with defiant purpose. This was what humanity looked like without the Imperium's boot on its neck. Desperate, yes. Struggling, absolutely. But free. The settlement's alarm bells rang before he could respond. Not the frantic clanging of orc attack, but a different rhythm, measured, deliberate, terrified. Vaith's face went pale. "No, not now. Not when we're already weak from the last assault." She ran to the wall, grabbed a battered pair of magnoculars, and looked skyward. When she turned back, her expression had shifted from exhaustion to something approaching religious dread. "Black Templars," she whispered. "An entire strike cruiser just translated in system, and they're heading straight for us." Omni-Man joined her at the wall and followed her gaze. High in the atmosphere, a warship descended through the clouds, smaller than the Navy cruisers he'd fought before, but somehow more intimidating. Gothic architecture taken to zealous extremes, black armor plating inscribed with golden scripture, and along its hull, chain symbols bigger than buildings, the Black Templars, the Imperium's most fanatical Space Marine chapter, crusaders who'd spent 10,000 years proving their loyalty through endless war, and they'd come to Golax for one reason: him. The Templars made planetfall with the subtlety of a meteor strike. Thunderhawk gunships descended in formation, disgorging squads of Space Marines whose black armor gleamed like midnight forged into metal. Tactical Marines established perimeter. Assault Marines took high ground with jump packs roaring, and in the center of their deployment, a figure that radiated authority like a nuclear reactor radiated heat: Marshal Hephaestus, commanding officer of the Crusade fleet. He stood 9 feet tall in Terminator armor, each plate inscribed with vows of hatred against Xenos, heretics, and the unclean. His voice boomed across the settlement through external Vox speakers. Unknown entity designated Theta 97, by decree of the Ordo Xenos and blessing of the Emperor himself, you are marked for extermination. Surrender is heresy. Resistance is futile. Accept the Emperor's mercy and die with dignity. Behind him, 50 Space Marines raised bolters in perfect unison. Omni-Man floated above the settlement, positioning himself between the Templars and the refugees. Behind him, Vaith and her people scrambled to evacuate. Not to fight, they knew better than to engage Astartes, but to run, to survive, to live another day. The standoff lasted exactly 10 seconds. Then Marshal Hephaestus pointed at Omni-Man with a power fist the size of a small vehicle and spoke a single word that echoed with 10 millennia of crusading faith: purge. The Black Templars opened fire as one. 50 bolters thundered in devastating symphony, filling the air with mass reactive shells designed to destroy everything from infantry to light armor. Omni-Man stood in the center of the storm and didn't move. Let them shoot. Let them see. The shells exploded against his skin, shredded his suit, filled the air with smoke and fury. And when the smoke cleared, when the Templars reloaded with practiced precision, when Marshal Hephaestus's helmet lenses widened fractionally in something that might have been shock, Omni-Man remained, unharmed, unbowed, completely done with restraint. His eyes glowed with barely contained fury. His voice cut through the settling smoke like a blade through silk. I tried diplomacy. I tried mercy. I saved your people even when you tried to kill me, but you just keep coming. He accelerated toward the Templar line, and for the first time in centuries, Marshal Hephaestus of the Black Templars felt something he'd thought purged from his psyche by decades of hypno-indoctrination and combat conditioning. He felt fear. The first Templar died before his brothers could process what happened. Omni-Man crossed the distance between hover position and battle line in a fraction of a second, faster than their enhanced nervous systems could track, faster than their armor's auto-senses could compensate. He drove his fist through the Space Marine's chest plate like it was aluminum foil, grabbed the power pack inside, and crushed it. The Marine collapsed, his twin hearts punctured, his armor systems sparking and dying. Omni-Man didn't wait, didn't gloat, didn't hesitate. He moved to the next Marine, then the next, fighting with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd finally stopped pulling punches. Ceramite cracked, plasteel shattered, holy wargear blessed by chaplains and maintained through century. As of service broke against Viltrumite, strength unleashed. In 10 seconds, 5 Space Marines fell. In 20, the number doubled. And the Black Templars, warriors who'd never retreated, never surrendered, never shown fear in the face of death, discovered what terror felt like. Marshal Hephaestus watched his brothers die and felt his tactical assessment shatter like glass. Space Marines weren't invincible. He knew that better than most. Tyranids could overwhelm them with numbers. Chaos could corrupt them from within. Eldar could outmaneuver them with impossible speed. But this was different. The entity fought like a living weapon designed specifically to kill Astartes. Every strike targeted weak points in their armor, neck seals, joint mechanisms, power pack connections. It moved too fast for bolter tracking, hit too hard for Ceramite to absorb, and worst of all, it fought with the cold precision of someone who'd analyzed their capabilities and found them wanting. Hephaestus activated his chapter-wide Vox. All units, Theta 97 is confirmed Primarch tier threat. Authorization code Omega Sanctus. Deploy heavy weapons and fall back to secondary positions. The admission tasted like ashes. Black Templars didn't fall back, but Black Templars also didn't die for nothing. Strategic withdrawal to regroup wasn't cowardice, it was necessary survival. The assault marines tried to engage from above, using their jump packs to achieve aerial superiority and rain plasma fire down on Omni-Man's position. It worked for exactly 4 seconds. Then he was among them, flying without visible propulsion, moving through 3-dimensional space, like gravity was a polite suggestion he'd chosen to ignore. He grabbed an assault marine mid-flight, used the warrior's momentum to swing him into 2 of his battle brothers, and all 3 crashed to the ground in a tangle of sparking armor and broken jump packs. Another marine tried to attack from behind, chainsawed screaming. Omni-Man caught the blade without looking, shattered it with a twist of his wrist, and delivered a backhand that sent the warrior tumbling through a ruined wall. He was everywhere, unstoppable. A one-man apocalypse carving through the Imperium's finest with terrifying ease. And behind their helmets' impassive faceplates, the Black Templars began to understand. They weren't fighting a demon, they were fighting something worse, something the Emperor himself might have struggled to contain. Commander Vaith and her people watched from their evacuation point, transfixed by horror and awe in equal measure. They'd lived under orc attacks for 15 years, had seen greenskin war bosses tear through fortifications, watched dreadnoughts lumber across battlefields, spewing death. But this was different. Omni-Man fought with surgical precision, every movement calculated to disable or destroy. No wasted motion, no unnecessary cruelty. Just brutal, efficient combat that reduced the Imperium's angels of death to broken ceramite and dying flesh. A young refugee, barely 18, clutching a salvaged laser gun, whispered what everyone was thinking. Is he on our side? Vaith didn't answer immediately. She watched Omni-Man tear through another squad, watched him spare the lives of Marines, who'd lost their weapons but not kill those still fighting. Finally, she spoke. I don't think he's on anyone's side. I think he's just trying to survive, and the Imperium won't let him. The young refugee considered that. Then maybe we're on the same side after all. Marshal Hephaestus deployed the last resort. From the strike cruiser in orbit, a dreadnought descended via drop pod, an ancient warrior entombed in a walking sarcophagus of blessed machinery. Brother Thalric had served the chapter for 900 years, his original body long since destroyed in battle, his consciousness preserved through arcane technology and relentless faith. The drop pod hit the battlefield like a meteor, its impact crater crushing 2 orc corpses left over from the earlier fighting. Hatches blew outward with explosive charges, and Thalric stomped forth on legs like armored pillars. His twin assault cannons began spinning before he'd fully emerged, and when they fired, the sound was like God clearing his throat with a belt-fed storm. Hundreds of rounds tore across the battlefield, each shell mass-reactive and blessed with anti-demon wards. They hit Omni-Man in a continuous stream of explosive fury. For the first time since the fight began, he staggered. The assault cannons weren't just damaging his suit anymore, they were actually hurting him. Omni-Man spat blood, the first blood he'd shed in this fight, and reassessed. The walking coffin had firepower to match its size, and unlike the regular Marines, its armor was thick. Enough to require actual effort to penetrate. Fine. If the Imperium wanted escalation, he'd show them what a Viltrumite considered serious combat. He flew straight at Thalric, tanking the assault cannon fire, closing distance faster than the dreadnought's targeting systems could adjust. Impact. The collision sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield and drove Thalric's massive frame backward, his mechanical legs carving trenches in the earth. Omni-Man grabbed the dreadnought's assault cannon barrels, crushed them shut like cheap tin, and ripped the entire weapon assembly from its mounting. Thalric responded by swinging his power fist, a weapon designed to crack open tanks, in a devastating uppercut. It connected solidly with Omni-Man's jaw, and for a moment the battlefield went silent. Everyone, Templar and refugee alike, waited to see what happened next. Omni-Man's head snapped back from the impact. Then he looked forward again, wiped blood from his lip and smiled. Finally, something that can actually hit back. The duel between Viltrumite and Dreadnought became the centerpiece of the entire battle. Thalric fought with 9 centuries of accumulated combat experience, every move calculated through strategic cogitators and muscle memory preserved in synthetic nerves. Omni-Man fought with raw physical superiority and adaptable intelligence, learning Thalric's patterns and exploiting weaknesses in real time. They traded blows that would have killed anything else, power fist strikes that shattered stone, punches that dented adamantium, grapples that tested the limits of machinery versus biology. Thalric activated his heavy flamer, bathing Omni-Man in promethium fire hot enough to melt steel. Omni-Man tanked the flames, grabbed Thalric's sarcophagus housing, and began to pull, attempting to tear the ancient warrior free from his mechanical prison. Thalric's vox speakers crackled with something between prayer and defiance. "I am iron within, iron without, death to the enemies of the Emperor." But his armor groaned under the strain, joints sparked, hull integrity warnings screamed across his internal displays. He was losing. Marshal Hephaestus made the call he'd been dreading since the battle began. He activated the orbital strike beacon, a signal that would bring lance fire from the cruiser above, devastating enough to kill everything in a 3-kilometer radius, including his own men, including the refugees, including Brother Thalric. The message transmitted instantly, and aboard the Righteous Fury, the weapons officer received authorization to fire. The lance batteries began their charging sequence, a process that would take 90 seconds before they could release their payload. 90 seconds for the enemy to escape, 90 seconds for his own brothers to evacuate. But Hephaestus knew neither would happen. The entity was too focused on Thalric to notice the beacon, and his marines would never abandon their marshal or their trapped brother. They would die here, on this forgotten world, fighting an enemy they couldn't defeat. But they would die as Black Templars, unbroken, uncompromising, faithful to the very end. He opened chapter Vox one final time. "Brothers, it has been an honor to crusade beside you. The Emperor protects. Even in death, we serve." Omni-Man sensed the change before he saw it, a shift in the Marines' body language, a resignation in their movements. They weren't retreating anymore. They were forming a perimeter around him, boxing him in, keeping him focused on Thalric while something else developed. His enhanced hearing caught it, a high-pitched whine from orbit, growing louder. Ionization building in the upper atmosphere. They were calling down orbital fire, on their own position, on their own people, again. The rage that had been building since he first crashed into this nightmare universe finally crested like a tidal wave hitting shore. These fanatics would rather die, would rather kill their own brothers, than accept any outcome except his destruction. Fine. If they wanted martyrdom so desperately, he'd give it to them, but not before he gave them something else first, the truth. He released Thalric, letting the damaged dreadnought stumble backward. Then he flew straight up, accelerating through the atmosphere at speeds that turned air into plasma around him. The Black Templars watched him flee and felt grim satisfaction. They'd driven off the threat, but their satisfaction lasted exactly as long as it took Omni-Man to reach the Righteous Fury in orbit. The Righteous Fury never saw him coming. Their auger arrays tracked atmospheric entry signatures, missile launches, torpedo spreads, anything that matched known attack patterns. But a single humanoid traveling at near relativistic speed didn't register as a threat until he was already through their void shields. Omni-Man hit the strike cruiser's port side like a kinetic kill vehicle, punching through armor plating that had withstood centuries of warfare. The impact sent shockwaves through the entire vessel, causing structural alerts to cascade across every deck. He didn't slow down, didn't stop. He carved a tunnel through the ship's interior at supersonic speed, destroying weapon systems, severing power conduits, gutting the infrastructure that kept 3,000 souls alive in the void. Within 30 seconds of breach, the Righteous Fury was crippled. Within 60, it was dying, and Omni-Man hadn't killed a single crew member directly. He'd just removed their ability to rain death on the PE. Opal below, the lance batteries went dark, the weapons officer's console sparked and died, and on the planet's surface, the orbital strike that would have killed everyone simply never came. Captain Dominicus of the Righteous Fury watched his ship die around him and activated the emergency Vox to Marshal Hephaestus on the planet below. "My lord, The entity has disabled our offensive capabilities. We are combat ineffective, requesting immediate evacuation and scuttling authorization." The transmission crackled with interference from damaged systems. Hephaestus's response came hollow and distant. "Denied. Repair what you can. We still have one weapon remaining." Dominicus didn't understand immediately. Then his surveyor called out readings from the planet's surface, and horror settled into his augmented heart like ice water. "Sir, massive energy surge detected at the Marshal's position. It's... Emperor preserve us, he's activated the cyclonic warhead. Every Black Templar's strike cruiser carried exterminatus-grade weapons, planet killers for when conventional warfare failed. The Marshal had brought one planet-side as standard protocol, and now, faced with an enemy he couldn't defeat, he was prepared to detonate it, to kill the entity, to kill his own brothers, to scorch the entire continent into radioactive glass, because that was faith, that was duty, that was the only language the Imperium truly spoke. On the surface, Vaith saw the warhead's activation through her magnoculars and felt her blood turn to ice. She'd served in the Imperial Guard long enough to recognize cyclonic weapons, the ultimate expression of the Imperium's scorched earth doctrine. When the enemy couldn't be defeated, you destroyed everything. Enemies, allies, civilians, even the very ground itself. Nothing survived cyclonic detonation. Not orcs, not fortifications, not hope. She grabbed her Voxcaster, searching for any frequency that might reach Omni-Man, might warn him, but he was in orbit, beyond her reach, unaware that the Marshal he'd been fighting was now preparing to take the entire world with him rather than accept defeat. Around her, refugees began to understand. Mothers grabbed children. Veterans checked weapon power packs one last time, not to fight, just to die armed, because that was all the dignity the Imperium left you in the end. The young refugee who'd spoken earlier turned to Vaith with tears streaming down his face. "We survived 15 years of orcs. We survived starvation and disease and abandonment, and we're going to die because some fanatic would rather kill us than admit he lost." Omni-Man emerged from the righteous fury and hovered in the void, staring at the planet below. He could see the settlement from orbit, a tiny cluster of lights in an otherwise dark continent, the people he'd saved from the orcs. The people who'd offered him shelter when the entire Imperium wanted him dead. And somewhere down there, he knew the Space Marines were regrouping, planning their next move. His enhanced vision could pick out individual figures, even from low orbit. He saw the Marshal standing beside something large and cylindrical, saw the Marines forming a perimeter around it instead of fleeing, saw the telltale glow of an arming sequence activating. Understanding hit him like a physical B1D towards. Low. They weren't retreating, they weren't calling for reinforcements, they were preparing to detonate a weapon powerful enough to be visible from space, a weapon that would kill everyone, their own brothers, the refugees, every living thing for hundreds of kilometers, just to ensure he died with them. The futility of it crashed over him in waves. You couldn't reason with this, couldn't fight it with strength alone. The Imperium's fanaticism was a singularity that consumed logic, mercy, even basic self-preservation. He had maybe 3 minutes before detonation. 3 minutes to decide, save himself and let thousands die, or try to stop a warhead he barely understood using technology he'd never encountered. The pragmatic Viltrumite choice was obvious. Survive, flee, find another planet. These people weren't his responsibility. He'd tried to help and it had only made things worse. But that voice in his head, the one that sounded like Mark, like Debbie, like every moment of doubt he'd ever had about the Viltrumite Empire's cold efficiency, asked a simple question. If you can save them and choose not to, what makes you different from the Imperium? The answer was, nothing. Absolutely nothing. He dove back into atmosphere, accelerating past Mach 30, burning through the air like a meteor in reverse. The settlement grew from a speck to distinct buildings. He could see individual people now, running, screaming, knowing death was coming and powerless to stop it. He reached the Marshal's position in 12 seconds. Hephaestus stood beside the cyclonic warhead, his hand on the final activation rune, and looked up at Omni-Man with the peaceful expression of a man who'd made peace with martyrdom. "You cannot stop this," Hephaestus said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "The warhead is armed. Deactivation requires 3 separate authentication codes, all held by officers currently in secure locations. Any attempt to move it will trigger immediate detonation. Any attempt to damage it will trigger immediate detonation. In 2 minutes and 14 seconds, this weapon will cleanse this world of your taint. We die gladly, knowing we serve the Emperor unto death. Omni-Man landed 10 feet away, close enough to strike, far enough to assess. The warhead was massive, easily 20 feet long, covered in religious iconography and warning runes. He could feel energy radiating from its core, could hear the steady countdown of its internal mechanisms. Everything Hephaestus said was probably true. The Imperium built its weapons with the same paranoid redundancy as everything else, but he'd stopped a ship's reactor from detonating by using his body as a heat sink. Maybe he could do something similar here. Not disarm it, that was impossible, but redirect it, absorb it. Take the explosion and channel it away from the civilians. It would hurt, might even kill him, but it was the only option that didn't involve standing by while fanatics murdered thousands in the name of faith. He moved before Hephaestus could react, faster than even Astarte's reflexes could track. Grabbed the warhead in both arms, feeling its impossible weight, not just physical mass, but the spiritual heaviness of a weapon designed to kill worlds. The Marshal's hand hit the detonation rune, and Omni-Man flew, straight up, through the atmosphere at maximum speed, carrying a bomb that was now ticking down its final 90 seconds. Behind him, he heard the Marshal's voice over Vox speakers, broadcasting to every Black Templar on the planet. The entity has taken the warhead. All units clear the blast zone. The E. Emperor protects. Omni-Man cleared the atmosphere in 40 seconds, cleared low orbit in 60. At 80 seconds, he was higher than any Imperial vessel, alone in the void, with a bomb counting down to 0. At 85 seconds, he realized he'd miscalculated. The warhead wasn't just nuclear, it was something worse. A weapon that tore apart reality at the atomic level, designed to kill everything down to the planetary crust. There was no absorbing this, no channeling it safely. When it detonated, it would kill him, possibly the only thing in this universe that could. The last 10 seconds stretched like hours. Omni-Man held the warhead tight, keeping it pointed away from the planet, and thought about all the choices that had led here. The decision to scout alone, the random dimensional malfunction, the crash landing on a hive world, every attempt at communication met with violence, every act of mercy repaid with escalation. He'd tried to be better than the Viltrumite empire that raised him, tried to show restraint in a universe that only understood force. And now he was going to die in the void, holding a bomb built by fanatics who'd rather destroy a world than admit defeat. The irony wasn't lost on him, neither was the tragedy. At 3 seconds he closed his eyes and thought of Earth, of Mark, of Debbie, of the life he'd left behind and would never see again. At 2 seconds he whispered into the void, knowing nobody would hear, "I tried." At 1 second, the cyclonic warhead detonated, and the galaxy learned what happened when you killed a Viltrumite. Nothing good at all. The explosion painted the void in colors that shouldn't exist. Not just light and fire, but reality tearing itself apart at the quantum level, atoms unmaking themselves, space screaming as fundamental forces collided in ways physics never intended. From the planet's surface, every living being stopped and stared upward at the flower of destruction blooming in orbit. It expanded outward in a perfect sphere, consuming empty void, swallowing stray debris, reaching for the stars themselves before finally dissipating in waves of radiation that would poison this system for centuries. Marshal Hephaestus watched through his helmet's visual filters, automatically darkened to protect his enhanced eyes from the glare. He'd seen cyclonic detonations before, watched worlds die from orbit, but this one felt different, personal. The entity had taken the warhead willingly, had sacrificed itself to save people it had no obligation to protect. For a brief moment, just a heartbeat, Hephaestus felt something the hypno-indoctrination should have purged from his psyche. Doubt, not about his faith, but about whether the entity had been the real threat here. Commander Vaith collapsed to her knees in the settlement, surrounded by refugees who'd thought they had seconds to live. The sky still glowed with residual radiation, painting everything in sickly green light. They should be dead. The warhead should have vaporized the continent, should have left nothing but radioactive glass stretching to the horizon. But the stranger, the entity the Imperium had labeled a threat, had carried their death into orbit and died holding it. She'd seen heroes before. Imperial Guard veterans who'd held lines against impossible odds. Space Marines who'd charged into certain death for the Emperor. But they'd all died for ideology, for doctrine, for an Emperor they'd never met. This being had died for people who weren't. His species weren't his concern, weren't even grateful. He died because it was the right thing to do. And that, Vaith realized, made him more faithful to humanity's survival than the Imperium had ever been. She stood, wiped tears she didn't remember shedding, and began organizing recovery. If he'd given them life, they'd damn well live it properly. In the warp, the Chaos Gods recoiled from the explosion's psychic echo. The warhead's detonation had torn a temporary wound in the fabric of reality, and through that wound they'd felt something unprecedented, a soul burning itself out not in worship, not in rage, not in despair, but in pure, stubborn defiance. Khorne leaned forward on his throne, intrigued despite himself. The entity had died in combat, yes, but not for glory, not for conquest, for protection. That was anathema to everything the Blood God represented, yet undeniably powerful. Tzeentch's 1,000 eyes blinked in discordant rhythm, analyzing possibilities that had suddenly collapsed into a single outcome. The entity was dead, the variable removed, the game simplified, and yet something felt wrong. The architect of fate's precognition showed futures still branching around the entity's existence, timelines where it continued to disrupt the great game's carefully orchestrated chaos. How could a dead thing cast shadows into potential futures, unless it wasn't quite dead, unless Viltrumite biology was more resilient than even gods anticipated? The wreckage drifted in high orbit, chunks of twisted metal that had once been the warhead's casing, clouds of radioactive debris spreading slowly through the void. And in the center of the destruction, tumbling end over end with no visible signs of life, was a body. Omni-Man's suit had been completely vaporized, his skin charred black and cracking like old leather. His right arm bent at an angle that spoke of shattered bones. His chest rose and fell so slowly it might have been residual muscle spasms. No heartbeat registered on any medical scanner. No brain activity showed on neurological sweeps. By every measurable standard, he was dead. But Viltrumite's cellular biology operated on principles that made conventional death complicated. Each cell could survive independently for hours, could repair catastrophic damage given sufficient time, could rebuild organ systems from cellular memory written into genetic code over thousands of years of evolution. He was dead, but he wouldn't stay that way. Not if nothing disturbed the healing process, not if he got the one thing Viltrumites needed after near-fatal trauma: time. He didn't get time. A tear opened in reality beside his drifting corpse, not a natural phenomenon but a deliberate incision made by something with power to cut through the barrier between material space and the immaterium. From that wound in space stepped a bloodthirster of Khorne, 20 feet of brass and fury and howling rage given demonic form. Its wings spread wide enough to cast shadows across the debris field. Its axe, the blade of eternal slaughter, dripped blood that boiled in the void's vacuum. It had been watching since the first Space Marine fell on Golax, had felt every death, every act of violence, every moment of brutal combat. And now, seeing the entity that had killed without worship, that had died without glory, hanging defenseless in the void, the demon made a decision, not to destroy, to claim. Khorne wanted this warrior, wanted to offer him power in exchange for eternal service, wanted to see what a Viltrumite could become if it served the Blood God's endless crusade. The bloodthirster reached out with a clawed hand, preparing to drag Omni-Man's dying form into the warp. The hand never made contact. A lance beam, coherent, focused, impossibly precise, struck the bloodthirster from behind, punching through its brass armor and scorching demonic flesh. The creature howled, not in pain but in fury, and spun to face its attacker. There, maneuvering into firing position with surprising grace for something so massive, was a ship unlike any Imperial Navy vessel, sleek where Imperial ships were Gothic, elegant where Imperial ships were brutal. and along its hull, runes that predated human civilization by millions of years, Eldar Craftworld identification markers. The Bloodthirster roared challenge, but another lance strike forced it backward, and then another, each beam calculated to drive it away from the drifting body without destroying it. Demons weren't stupid. This wasn't a fight worth taking. Not here, not now, not against Eldar, who'd clearly been observing the situation and had chosen to intervene. The Bloodthirster retreated through its warp portal, taking its master's interest with it. Horn would find other ways to claim this warrior. The warp was patient, chaos was eternal. The Eldar ship, a sleek frigate from Craftworld Ulthwé, extended a tractor beam and pulled Omni-Man's body aboard with delicate precision. On the bridge, Farseer Taldir studied the entity through psychic senses that saw past flesh into possibility itself. Her seers had detected his arrival in the galaxy weeks ago, had watched his collision with the Imperium through the threads of fate, had debated endlessly whether to intervene. The Mon-Ki would destroy him, that much was certain, but he represented something the Eldar hadn't seen in millennia, a variable completely outside the Imperium's control, untainted by chaos, powerful enough to disrupt carefully laid plans through sheer unpredictability. Some among her council had argued for elimination, others for recruitment. She'd chosen a third option, observation with conditional assistance. Save him from chaos, learn what he represented, and if he proved useful in the coming darkness, the great threat her visions showed approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge, then perhaps the Eldar would have gained an unlikely ally. If he proved dangerous, they could always kill him later. Omni-Man woke screaming in a healing cocoon, surrounded by Wraithbone architecture and sounds he didn't recognize. His body was agony, every cell repairing itself simultaneously, bones knitting back together, organs regenerating from catastrophic trauma. He thrashed against the cocoon's membrane, instinct driving him to escape, to fight, to survive. Eldar attendants, bone singers skilled in biological manipulation, rushed forward with calming runes that glowed with psychic energy. One of them, her voice melodious despite speaking Gothic, attempted communication. "Peace, stranger. You are aboard Craftworld Ulthwé. You nearly died in the void. We have saved your life." Omni-Man's rational mind tried to process that information through the haze of pain and confusion. Saved? By whom? Why? The last thing he remembered was the warhead detonating, reality coming apart, the certainty of death. He should be dead, would have preferred death to waking into yet another faction, another agenda, another group with plans for him. But as consciousness stabilized and pain receded to manageable levels, one thought dominated all others. He'd survived, against cyclonic detonation, against the Imperium's best efforts, against all probability. He'd survived, and that meant he could still escape this nightmare galaxy. Farseer Taldir entered the healing chamber, her presence radiating authority and something else, the weight of futures seen and choices made. She studied Omni-Man with eyes that had witnessed the fall of empires and the birth of gods. When she spoke, her voice carried centuries of weary knowledge. "You wonder why we saved you. The answer is simple and complex. Simple, because chaos sought to claim you, and anything chaos wants, we deny. Complex, because you represent a thread in fate's tapestry that should not exist, yet does. You are not of this galaxy. Your presence disrupts prophecies millennia old. The question we must answer, the question you must help us answer, is whether that disruption leads to salvation or ruin." She moved closer, and despite his injuries, Omni-Man tensed for combat, but Taldir only smiled, sad and knowing. "Rest, stranger. Heal. When you are whole, we will speak of what comes next. But know this, the Imperium will not stop hunting you. Chaos will not stop tempting you, and the galaxy itself grows darker with each passing year. You sought survival. We offer something different. Purpose." Recovery took 3 days by Eldar reckoning, an impossibly short time frame for injuries that should have required months of regeneration. But Viltrumite biology defied conventional medical understanding, and the Eldar Bonesingers watched in fascinated horror as Omni-Man's body rebuilt itself from near-total destruction. Bones that had shattered into fragments knitted back together stronger than before. Organs that had liquefied from radiation exposure reformed from cellular templates. Even his brain, which had suffered catastrophic trauma from the explosion's psychic shockwave, healed without apparent memory loss or cognitive damage. By the third day, he was walking. By the fourth, he was demanding answers. And by the fifth, Farsia Taldir decided he was stable enough to understand the truth about why the Eldar had intervened. She brought him to the Dome of Crystal Seers, where the craft world's most powerful psychers gathered to read the skein of fate. What she showed him there would haunt him for however long he survived in this nightmare galaxy. The seers stood in a circle around a pool of liquid crystal that reflected not light but possibility itself. Omni-Man watched as images formed in the pool's surface, not recordings but visions pulled from probability and precognition. He saw the galaxy as the Eldar saw it, a dying thing, hemorrhaging light into encroaching darkness. He saw the Imperium's million worlds burning with pointless wars, whole sectors consumed by orc invasions and chaos incursions. He saw the Eye of Terror bleeding corruption across the Astronomican's reach. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold, despite everything he'd survived. From beyond the galaxy's edge, from the intergalactic void where stars died unmourned, came a shadow. Not metaphorical darkness, but literal absence. A hunger so vast it consumed entire star systems. A fleet of B'Thor-T, biological nightmares that moved through space like locusts through wheat fields. The Tyranids. Taldir's voice cut through his shock. This is what approaches, not in years but in decades. The Great Devourer comes to consume all life in this galaxy, and when it arrives, there will be no negotiation, no mercy, only feeding. Omni-Man stared at the vision, his tactical mind already calculating impossible odds. The Tyranid fleets shown in the crystal pool numbered in the billions, living ships, each one a bioweapon designed through evolution to kill and consume with perfect efficiency. He'd fought strong opponents before, Viltrumites, superhumans, space marines, but those were individuals or small groups. What he saw in the vision was a tide of biological destruction so vast that individual strength meant nothing. "Why show me this?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Taldir gestured to the pool, and the vision shifted, showed possible futures branching from his presence. In some, he died fighting the Tyranids alongside desperate defenders. In others, he fled the galaxy entirely, seeking escape through dimensional rifts. And in a few, very few, he became something different, a unifier, a catalyst, someone who could force the galaxy's fractured factions to cooperate against extinction. "Because you are chaos," Taldir said quietly. "Not chaos as the ruinous powers define it, but disorder in fate's pattern. You were not supposed to exist here. Your presence creates possibilities that should not be possible. And in the coming darkness, impossible possibilities may be our only salvation." Before Omni-Man could respond, alarms screamed throughout the craft world. Eldar warriors rushed to defensive positions as their scanners detected incoming vessels translating from the warp at the system's edge. Not orc scrap ships, not chaos raiders. Imperial Navy, a full battle group comprising 3 battleships, a dozen cruisers, and enough escort vessels to blockade a planet. Leading them was a vessel Omni-Man recognized from stolen Imperial data files. The Macragger's Honor, flagship of Robut Gilliman, the returned Primarch, Lord Commander of the Imperium, and one of the Emperor's gene-forged sons. The single most powerful military leader in the galaxy had come personally to deal with the entity that had survived cyclonic detonation and embarrassed the Imperium's forces. Taldir's expression shifted from calculated calm to genuine concern. "They found us faster than anticipated. Gilliman does not deploy without absolute certainty. Someone informed him of your location." She turned to Omni-Man with sudden urgency. "You have a choice now. Fight beside us when the Primarch demands your surrender, or flee while we hold them off. Choose quickly. He will not negotiate." Aboard the Macragger's Honor, Reboot Gilliman reviewed the tactical data with growing unease. The entity, Theta 97 in official reports, had survived a cyclonic warhead at point-blank range, killed multiple squads of Astartes, crippled Imperial Navy vessels, and now sheltered with Xenos who'd somehow located it before inquisitorial agents could. The strategic implications were staggering. If the Eldar could recruit such a being, if they could turn its power against the Imperium, entire Crusade fleets might fall. But beyond tactics, Gilliman felt something deeper: curiosity. The entity fought without chaos corruption, showed mercy despite overwhelming force, sacrificed itself to save Imperial City. Eisens the Imperium itself had condemned to death. That didn't match demon behavior, didn't match any Xenos profile in his 10,000-year experience. This was something new, and in a galaxy where everything old had failed, perhaps new deserved investigation before extermination. He opened Vox channels to the Eldar craft world, knowing they'd receive the transmission. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd built empires and destroyed heretics. "I am Reboot Gilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium. I seek parley with the entity designated Theta 97, not surrender, not combat, conversation. If you are capable of reason, prove it now." The request shocked everyone. Taldea's seers gasped audibly. Primarchs didn't negotiate with Xenos, didn't offer parley to declared threats. Omni-Man studied the transmission's waveform through the Eldar's communication systems, analyzing vocal stress patterns for deception. He found none, just exhaustion, curiosity, and something that sounded almost like hope. Against every survival instinct, screaming warnings, against the Viltrumite doctrine that taught suspicion of every overture, he made a decision that would define everything to follow. "I'll meet him," Omni-Man said. "Taldea whirled to face him. "That is suicide. The moment you leave our protection, the Imperium will—" He cut her off. "They'll try to kill me whether I hide or talk. At least this way I'll know why. And maybe, there's one person in this galaxy who'll listen before shooting." He'd been running for weeks, fighting for weeks, dying for weeks. If he was going to keep surviving in this nightmare, he needed information, needed to understand what he was truly facing. And a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, might provide answers the Eldar couldn't or wouldn't. The parley occurred in neutral void, neither aboard Eldar craftworld nor Imperial vessel, but on a small asteroid designated as meeting ground. Both sides deployed forces, Eldar rangers hidden in crater shadows, Imperial Astartes in defensive positions, weapons trained on each other with the fragile peace of nuclear standoff. And in the center, two figures met face to face. Reboot Gilliman stood 13 feet tall in his armor of fate, a demigod who'd fought in the Emperor's Great Crusade and been resurrected to save a dying Imperium. Omni-Man stood 6 feet tall in borrowed Eldar clothing, a warrior from another universe who'd wanted nothing more than to go home. For 10 seconds, they studied each other in silence. Gilliman spoke first. "You are not what I expected. Not demon, not Xenos, not even a human. You are something else." Omni-Man met his gaze without flinching. "I'm someone who crashed here by accident and has been trying not to die ever since. Your Imperium didn't give me much choice." Gilliman's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes shifted, recognition perhaps of a truth he'd been avoiding. "No, I suspect we didn't." What followed was a conversation that would be redacted from all official Imperial records, classified beyond even inquisitorial clearance. Gilliman asked questions. Omni-Man answered honestly, about Viltrumites, about Earth, about the dimensional accident that stranded him here. He didn't mention his past crimes, his work for the Viltrumite Empire, the people he'd killed in conquest, just the facts: warrior, soldier, survivor. In return, Gilliman explained the Imperium's perspective, a galaxy where chaos corrupted from within, where Xenos threatened from without, where 10,000 years of war had ground humanity into a machine that could only respond to threats with overwhelming violence. "We are not evil, Gilli," said, and the weariness in his voice carried the weight of ages. "We are desperate. Every mercy we show becomes weakness exploited. Every compromise we make becomes corruption's foothold. We have become the very tyranny my father sought to prevent, and I return to find an Imperium I barely recognize." He looked at Omni-Man with something approaching regret. You survived cyclonic detonation to save people we condemned. That makes you either impossibly noble or impossibly foolish. Perhaps both. Omni-Man considered his next words carefully. This was a pivotal moment, the first real conversation he'd had with Imperial authority since arriving. What happens now? He asked. Do you try to kill me? Recruit me? Lock me away for study? Guilliman was silent for a long moment, and behind them both Eldar and Astartes tensed for violence. Finally, the Primarch spoke. I offer you something the Imperium rarely grants. A choice. Join us. Fight for humanity. Not as a slave, but as an ally. Use your power against the enemies that threaten our survival. In exchange, I grant you autonomy within defined parameters and protection from inquisitorial elimination. Or refuse and I let you go. The Eldar will shelter you, and I will mark you as neutral rather than hostile. But if you choose freedom, know this. The galaxy is dying. The darkness Taldir showed you is real, and when the Tyranids arrive, there will be no place to hide. Not for you, not for anyone. Individual strength means nothing against extinction. He extended a gauntleted hand. Choose, warrior, but choose understanding the stakes. Omni-Man stared at Guilliman's extended hand and felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him like the gravity of a dying star. Join the Imperium, the fanatical empire that had tried to exterminate him at every turn, that sacrificed billions in the name of an emperor who might be nothing more than a corpse on a throne. Or refuse and face the coming darkness alone, knowing that individual strength meant nothing against galaxy-devouring swarms. Neither option offered freedom, neither offered hope, just different flavors of survival purchased with compromise. He thought about Mark back on Earth, about the conversations they'd had about what it meant to be a hero. Mark believed in saving people because it was right, not because it served an empire. But Mark had never faced a universe where righteousness was a luxury nobody could afford, where mercy became weakness and weakness became extinction. Omni-Man had spent weeks in this nightmare galaxy. He'd killed space marines, crippled warships, survived weapons designed to kill worlds, and he'd learned one fundamental truth. Warhammer 40,000 wasn't a universe for heroes, it was a universe for survivors, and survivors did what they must. He didn't take Guilliman's hand. The Primarch's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes acknowledged the refusal, not surprise, but perhaps recognition of what he'd known all along. Omni-Man spoke carefully, knowing that every word would be analyzed by both Eldar and Imperial forces. I appreciate the offer, but I didn't escape one empire just to serve another. I'll find my own path, my own purpose, and if the darkness comes, when it comes, I'll face it on my own terms, not yours, not theirs. He gestured toward the Eldar positions. I'm done taking sides in other people's wars. Guilliman lowered his hand slowly, and for a moment, Omni-Man saw something in the Primarch's face that looked almost like understanding. Then you are either braver or more foolish than I calculated, Guilliman said quietly. The galaxy has no place for lone warriors. No corner safe from the wars consuming all of us, but I gave my word. You may go, and I will mark you as neutral rather than hostile. For now. The unspoken threat hung between them. Neutrality was a temporary status. One wrong move, one action perceived as hostile, and the full weight of the Imperium would fall upon him again. Taldir appeared beside Omni-Man through a webway portal, her arrival silent and sudden. She regarded Guilliman with millennia of racial memory, ancient hatred mixed with grudging respect for one of the few Mon-Ki who understood the stakes. He has made his choice, Primarch. Honor your word, or prove once more that Imperial promises carry no weight. Guilliman's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I honor my word, Witch, but understand this. Your craft world shelters a variable that could destabilize entire sectors. If he acts against the Imperium, your protection becomes conspiracy. The consequences will be severe. He turned to his honor guard, ultramarines who'd watched the entire exchange in tense silence, and issued orders that stunned them all. All Imperial forces stand down. Mark Entity Theta 97 as neutral hostile. Observe but do not engage unless provoked. Authorization code, Guilliman Omega 7. The fleet began maneuvering away from the asteroid, retreating to the system's edge. But as the Macraga's honor prepared to translate back into The warp, Gilliman sent one final transmission directly to Omni-Man. When the Tyranids come, neutrality dies with the first world they consume. Remember that, warrior, and remember who offered you purpose before the darkness took everything. Back aboard the Eldar craft world, Omni-Man stood in the observation dome and watched the Imperial fleet vanish into warp space. He'd survived, again, turned down an offer that many would consider generous by this galaxy's brutal standards. But at what cost? He was still stranded, still alone, still hunted by forces he barely understood. The Eldar would shelter him, yes, but Taldir had made their position clear. He was a tool to be used against coming threats, not a guest to be honored. Every faction saw him the same way, as a weapon, a variable, a piece to be moved across boards in games he hadn't chosen to play. The only difference was whether they wanted him serving their agenda or dead. He thought about the refugees on Golax Prime, the people he'd saved by carrying the cyclonic warhead into orbit. They'd remember him as a hero, probably, build stories about the stranger who'd sacrificed himself for their survival. But he knew the truth. He hadn't saved them because he was heroic. He'd saved them because letting them die would have made him no different from the Imperium. And he needed that difference, needed to believe he was still more than just another conqueror wearing different colors. Taldir joined him at the observation portal, her presence accompanied by the subtle psychic pressure all Eldar radiated. "You refused Gilliman's offer," she said, though it wasn't a question. "Many would consider that foolish. The Imperium offers protection, resources, purpose. We offer only temporary shelter and uncertain alliance." Omni-Man kept watching the stars, billions of them scattered across a galaxy at war with itself. "I've served an empire before. Followed orders I knew were wrong because I convinced myself it was for the greater good. My empire, my people, my justification. And I learned that empires don't change warriors. Warriors change themselves to serve empires. I'm done with that." He finally turned to face her. "You said I'm chaos in fate's pattern, that my presence creates impossible possibilities. Maybe that's what this galaxy needs. Not another soldier following orders, not another piece on someone's game board, just something unpredictable, something that doesn't fit the pattern." Taldir regarded him with ancient eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall. "Unpredictability can lead to salvation or ruin," she said softly. "The skein shows both futures in equal measure, but perhaps that is better than certainty of doom." Days became weeks aboard the craft world. Omni-Man learned what he could about the galaxy's factions, its wars, its unending cycles of violence. The Eldar taught him about the webway, the network of ancient tunnels through reality that allowed faster-than-light travel without touching the warp. They showed him how to recognize chaos corruption, how to avoid drawing the ruinous power's attention. They even shared fragments of prophecy, visions of possible futures where he stood against impossible odds, sometimes victorious, often dying in glorious futility. But they wouldn't teach him how to get home, couldn't actually. The dimensional barriers between universes weren't something even Eldar science could breach reliably. He was trapped, not for weeks or months, but potentially forever. That realization settled into his bones like frost, permanent, inescapable, soul-deep. He would die in this galaxy, maybe in battle against Tyranids, maybe executed by inquisitors who stopped honoring Gilliman's neutrality decree, maybe just slowly over centuries, as the weight of endless war ground even Viltrumite endurance into dust. But he would die here, far from Earth, far from Mark, far from anyone who'd remember him as more than a threat to be contained or a weapon to be wielded. In the warp, the Chaos Gods watched and waited. Khorne brooded on his brass throne, frustrated by the warrior who killed without worship, but intrigued by his potential. Tzeentch wove schemes within schemes, already planning how to manipulate the variable into useful patterns. Nurgle laughed at the futility of it all. Even Viltrumites aged, even invincible warriors eventually succumbed to entropy. And Slaanesh, youngest of the four, tasted the despair radiating from Omni-Man's soul and found it exquisite. He was powerful, yes, resilient, absolutely, but he was also alone, far from home, trapped in a universe that responded to mercy with escalation and kindness with suspicion. That kind of despair was delicious. Given time, given pressure, given the right circumstances, he could be broken. could be corrupted, could become something magnificent in service to excess and sensation. The gods were patient, they had eternity, and Omni-Man had only the desperate now of survival without hope of escape. Eventually, he would crack. They always did. On the fortress world of Macragge, Robute Guilliman sat in his private chamber and reviewed data streams from across the Imperium. Orc invasions spreading through 3 sectors, chaos incursions tearing apart a dozen worlds, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, splitting the galaxy in half, and reports from his astropathic choir confirming what the Eldar had shown Omni-Man. Tyrannid splinter fleets approaching from the intergalactic void, each one larger than the last. The Imperium was dying, not quickly, like a warrior falling in battle, but slowly, like an old man succumbing. Bing to 1,000 cuts, and he, returned from death to save it, could only watch as the patient bled out despite his best efforts. The entity, Omni-Man, as some reports called him, represented something Guilliman hadn't felt in centuries: uncertainty. Not about victory or defeat, but about possibility. A warrior who didn't serve chaos, didn't worship Xenos gods, didn't kneel to the Imperium's crushing doctrine. Just fought, survived, made choices based on conscience rather than programming. If such a being could exist in this nightmare galaxy, perhaps others could too. Perhaps the Imperium's binary worldview, human or Xenos, loyal or heretic, alive or purged, was finally showing cracks. He drafted a sealed order to the Inquisition: observe but do not eliminate, study but do not capture, let the variable exist, see what possibilities emerged. It was a gamble, it might be heresy, but Guilliman had spent 10,000 years dead, and he'd returned to find an Imperium that desperately needed something it had forgotten how to create: hope. Far from craft worlds and fortress worlds, on the dead moon where he'd first rested after fleeing the Imperium, a lone figure stood in a crater and looked up at the stars. Omni-Man had returned here alone, using the Eldar's gifts to navigate the webway far enough to reach relatively safe space. He needed time away from factions and agendas, needed to process everything he'd learned. The galaxy was dying. Every major faction saw him as a tool. Chaos wanted to corrupt him. The Imperium wanted to control him. The Eldar wanted to use him. And somewhere beyond the galaxy's edge, a force approached that would consume everything: loyalist and traitor, human and Xenos, warrior and civilian, without distinction or mercy. He was powerful, but not powerful enough to stop extinction alone. He was resilient, but not resilient enough to survive forever without allies. He was trapped, and the only question remaining was, how would he choose to fight back against the darkness, with the Imperium's brutal efficiency, the Eldar's calculating manipulation, or something different, a third path nobody had tried because nobody had his unique combination of power, perspective, and stubborn refusal to accept binary choices? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking across a dead world's horizon. He would fight, not for empires or gods or prophecies, but for the people caught between grinding gears of wars they didn't choose, the refugees, the abandoned, the expendable. He couldn't save the galaxy, but maybe he could save enough individual souls to prove that mercy still mattered in a universe built on cruelty. It wasn't much, it wasn't victory, but it was something, and in Warhammer 40,000, something was the closest anyone ever got to hope. The galaxy turned on its axis, indifferent to one warrior's choice. Wars continued, fleets burned, worlds died, and in the cold void between stars, Omni-Man flew toward an uncertain future, carrying one certainty with him. He had entered Warhammer 40K by accident, but he would face what came next by choice. Not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as something this nightmare galaxy hadn't seen in 10,000 years. A warrior who still believed that strength should protect rather than conquer, that power should serve rather than dominate, that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, individual actions still mattered. He was wrong, of course. The galaxy would teach him that eventually, would break him down through attrition, corruption, or simple exhaustion. But for now, flying through the void with nothing but determination and fading hope, he chose to believe differently. And maybe, just maybe, that belief would last long enough to matter, or Maybe it would die with him, unmourned and forgotten, just another footnote in a galaxy that devoured heroes and villains with equal hunger. Either way, the story was far from over. It had only just begun, and in Warhammer 40k, beginnings were often indistinguishable from endings. Welcome to the galaxy without mercy. Survival is not guaranteed, victory is impossible, but you fight anyway, because fighting is all that remains.